I want to translate these four things sort of into the basics of a health and safety program, which is sort of the core message that I want to talk to you about today. There's sort of four areas that if you work in these areas and you strive for excellence in these four areas, you're way above basic compliance with the law. You've got good health and safety in place, right? And the four areas line right up with those four grandfather teachings that I just went through, right? And they really follow a ton of teachings within the medicine wheel. And one of my favorite medicine wheel teachings is vision, relationship, knowledge, action, right? And they line perfectly up with those. So they are commitment, right? So you need to commit to health and safety, right? And really that's showing that love for your coworkers and for your community, right? You need to have set roles and responsibilities, right? And that falls right in with that respect teaching, right? But everybody needs to understand what their expectations are, what their requirements are, what they need to do, what they have to fulfill, right? And everybody needs to understand everyone else's expectations and requirements, right? Then you need to have a good way to understand your hazards and manage them, right? And that's a lot of sort of inward looking, right? Looking at yourself and becoming wiser and learning about your own organization and your own departments and the tasks and activities and equipment and materials you work with and handle. But there is sort of a very sort of precise way to manage hazards. And that's one of the most fundamental concepts in health and safety. There's another webinar in, I believe, a month or so that is really going to focus in on that piece. So I'm going to give a high level overview of it, but the next webinar in this series, my colleague is going to dive in deep to that and really sort of flesh that out and explain how you put that into practice. Okay? And finally, making sure when you do have issues, when things do crop up, things could, that you have a good way to report and investigate those things and learn from them so that you can move on from them and you can build new things into your health and safety. And if you do these four things and you do these four things really, really well, you will have, excellence in health and safety. You'll be way over and above the basics of compliance with the law. So let's talk about commitment first. There's sort of two areas I want to dive into. I'm going to talk about this concept of a health and safety policy, and then we're going to talk about the importance of allocating resources toward health and safety, which doesn't necessarily mean junya, right? It doesn't necessarily mean money. In fact, it often doesn't mean money, but we'll dive into that when we get to it. Policy is a requirement in both provincial and federal legislation. And there is a free, this template's right off our website. You can download that for free on WSPS.ca. You can just search up health and safety policy, and this will be something that comes up. But it really is sort of a vision of what you want in terms of health and safety for your organization, for your community. Right? It's almost sort of your guiding compass of how we commit to health and safety. And you put that on paper, right? When it comes to a First Nation, it really is a sort of a best practice to not only have it the administration good with it, but to have chief and council approve it. And whatever that looks like for your First Nation, it's really sort of an inside thing. So I don't know if it really needs a BCR. I think a motion is sufficient, but whichever of those two is easier to do, it's nice to have that done, right? And put that right on your health and safety policy. This is adopted by motion, and then the motion number, or BCR number, right? And then have it signed off by your administrator or your CAO or whoever that topmost person on the administration side is. You don't necessarily need it signed off by the chief or any council members because they're signing that motion or that BCR, right? And then have it dated, right? And it's not hard to create this, right? And it's nice to work in your own values and your own, our own cultural teachings into it. But there is this sort of baseline template if you're interested in grabbing that off of our website if you don't have a health and safety policy. This is really a starting point for health and safety for any organization. Okay. Now, when it comes to allocating resources, there was a study done a while ago now in terms of which organizations excel at health and safety and which don't. And the ones that excel have assigned the administrative components of health and safety to a champion. It doesn't necessarily mean that that health and safety champion is a health and safety professional or an expert at health and safety or amazing at training or anything like that. That doesn't have to be it, their role. But there is a lot of administrative burden in managing health and safety. So you sort of need a person that can take that on and hold on to those records and manage the documents, whether that be sign-in sheets or the health and safety policy, which you have to update and change every single year, right? So we need someone to manage, okay, we got to redate this and we got to get this before chief and council again and get them to adopt it and get it signed off and put up again, So having somebody that sort of has that as part of their job, and whether that's sort of someone in a executive assistant kind of a role, reception administrator kind of a role, or whether that's assigned to a specific person in your organization that has other HR responsibilities or training related responsibilities. But having somebody that it's like, this is that person's job is going to go so far in making sure that you are on top of managing all the documents and records associated with health and safety, right? Because it's not just the programs and policies and procedures. This person doesn't have to write those, but they do have to sort of manage where those are housed and how people access them, and if they need to be updated, who has the ability to change the date on them or whatever, right? It's sign-in sheets. It's there's all sorts of different documents and records that's part of. I'm not going to list them all out here, but there's all sorts of documents and records that this person needs to be able to manage, file, organize, have access to as part of your health and safety. Right? You need to provide time for health and safety at your organization. So that might be time for people to attend training. That might be time for people to do risk assessments. That might be time for people to just talk about health and safety regularly, right? But giving adequate time to the managers and supervisors, but all workers, so that they can carry out and do health and safety related activities, that's important, right? You need to make sure that everyone knows what they're doing from a health and safety perspective, right? So competent is a word that we use provincially that's very different than the sort of dictionary definition of competent. And I'll just quickly highlight it. Our regular thought when we think somebody is competent, we think somebody knows what they're doing, someone who's good at something, right? And that's part of the definition of competent in the provincial health and safety legislation, but it's actually a couple pieces more involved than just being good at something or knowing all about something because you have some training or experience in it, right? In addition to that, they have to have a sort of a familiarity with the basic laws and compliance with those basic laws to be competent. And then in addition to that, they have to know all the hazards related to that task or that piece of equipment that they're competent in using, right? So competence is so much more from a health and safety perspective than just being good at something. It's really knowing all the basic rules to do that thing and having a good understanding of how you could be hurt when you do that thing. Right? And if a First Nation ensures that all of their workers are competent in whatever their tasks are, equipment or materials, then they're they're on their way to managing and making sure that we're going to prevent potential injuries. And finally, time needs to be spent monitoring health and safety and sort of making sure that you are working towards improving health and safety regularly. So whether that's chief and council once a year reviews where you're at with health and safety when the new motion comes in for the updated health and safety policy, or whether that's your senior management team underneath your band administrator or whatever that topmost person is, their title is, They spend, quarterly time reviewing health and safety as part of their quarterly review of everything else they talk about related to your organization. But there needs to be someone sort of overseeing health and safety. It doesn't have to be someone specific. It can be a group, as I've sort of alluded to, but some people need to be sort of looking at your health and safety and determining, and this is over and above the committee, by the way. This is really sort of on the employer to sort of monitor that program and, take strides to sort of slowly improve it over time, right? So that's commitment. Let's move now into the South, into roles and responsibilities. And there's two things I want to touch on, something called the IRS, much different acronym for us here in Ontario than for our neighbors to the south of us. And then we'll talk about what the committee's role is as part of that. So the internal responsibility system is the foundation of all health and safety legislation all around the world. Okay. It started in Ontario in the first provincial Green Book in Ontario in 1979, and it everyone said that's such a great idea, and everyone started adopting it. So now it's across all the different jurisdictions in Canada, but pretty well every westernized country in the world that has health and safety law uses some concept related to this internal responsibility system. And really, it's legislated teamwork, right? It's like these three parties in the workplace, the employer, the supervisors, and the workers, all sort of share in health and safety. I love this metaphor of a three-legged stool. If you were to buy a three-legged stool, you would need each of these legs in place, right? You can't buy a three-legged stool that's missing a leg and expect to sit on it to go fishing, right? It's not going to work for you, right? And that's sort of the idea behind this IRS, that every party has their own sort of role to play to fulfill health and safety related responsibilities, but they are sort of all interlinked and they are meshed together, those different roles. And we'll look at each of those in turn in a second. But I just want to talk about that system or that intermeshing a little bit more. Imagine you were sitting on this stool and one of the legs happened to crack and break. You'd fall over, you'd hit the ground, right? And you wouldn't be mad at one particular leg. You wouldn't be like, oh, shoot, leg A, this is all your fault, or leg two, why'd you do that, right? You wouldn't be thinking of it as a perfectly good stool with a broken leg. You'd be thinking of it as a broken stool, right? And that is sort of the main premise behind health and safety, right? Very difficult if there is a failure in your IRS or a hazard exists or an incident happens, it's very difficult to pin that on one particular party. Well, this is chief and counsel's fault, or this is that person's boss's fault, right? Even if it feels cut and dried, like worker didn't wear the personal protective equipment required, worker got hurt. All the worker's fault, right? Well, wait a minute. Supervisor's supposed to make sure they have that on, right? Chief and counsel is supposed to make sure that the manager has a line item, a budget to buy PPE and are providing the PPE, right? So everyone has a role to play to make sure that that worker is wearing the PPE. It's not all on the worker, right? And there's several examples I can give across the legislation where you can sort of see that flesh out across all the three parties. Right? So let's look at them high level. These are just some kind of quick snapshots, right? The employer or chief and counsel have a responsibility to create and review not only your policy, that one-page sort of commitment to health and safety, but your full program, right? So all the things you have as part of health and safety. And there's like a menu that pops up. Whether that's your onboarding or your I don't know, safe lifting training or your public works department, operating a loader, whatever that looks like, all the different elements of health and safety is sort of the program pieces, right? The employer is also responsible for ensuring that you follow the rules that you've set in your programs and procedures. Right? So if you've said every worker when they start at our community will take, XYZ health and safety training before they start, then the employer is making sure that that stuff is happening. That person, when they start, is taking those 3 training programs, whatever that looks like, right? So whatever the expectations are that you set for health and safety, the employer has to ensure that you are following and complying with those expectations. this is probably their most important responsibility. They have to ensure everyone is protected at work. Right? It's called the general duty, and it's really sort of an umbrella or a catch-all responsibility of chief and council. Got to make sure that everyone that's working at your First Nation, their health and safety is being protected. Massive responsibility, the most important of all, and the most charged against when regulators do come in and levy a charge against an employer. They tend to throw the general duty on top of it. That's a bit of a different, this is the wording from the federal, from the Canada Labor Code Part 2, has a bit different wording provincially, but that means the same thing. Right? We're going to protect our workers while they're at work, protect their health and safety. They have to work with the committee and liaise with, consult with, ask for input from the committee for a number of different things. And they have to ensure that your supervisors are qualified, which means the same thing as competent, but that's the language in the federal health and safety legislation. We talk about being qualified, and it really means that someone is able to do the work in a healthy and safe way. So in other words, they have to know the basics of the rules. They'd have to know all the hazards to be able to do it in that healthy and safe way. Right? So it's the same thing provincially and federally when it comes to making sure those supervisors are qualified or competent. And then they have to provide PPE. Whatever the workers need to be safe needs to be given to them so they can be safe in the workplace. Moving on to the supervisor, which is anybody in a supervisory capacity, from your band administrator or whatever that title is at the top of your organization, right down to like a team leader, lead hand, kind of any quasi-supervisory role, right? Their responsibilities sort of revolve around protecting just their department, right? And to that end, they're going to make sure that their workers are following the expectations that have been set, right, in terms of your program and your rules and your safety requirements, right? They're going to make sure that the workers are using the protective equipment and safety stuff that they've been given to use. They have to actually tell workers about any and all hazards that the workers may face in the task that they've been assigned. And they have a responsibility to make sure they're providing information, they're instructing and training the workers, and they're monitoring the workers, they're overseeing the workers, they're supervising the workers, right? And kind of coming along with that would be coaching the workers if they're not doing something properly, or praising them when they are doing something properly, which we often forget when we think about holding somebody into account. But that's sort of the supervisor's role for their own direct reports. And then for all the rest of us, the workers, we got the least amount of responsibilities. All we have to do is use the safety stuff we've been given to use, right? Follow the expectations that have been set. Report if we have any concerns related to health and safety, or if something does happen, we have to bring that stuff forward. And then just work safely in general, right? We talk about the right to refuse unsafe work, which exists provincially and federally. It is a right, but it's also a responsibility. You have to refuse unsafe work. That is your duty as a worker in both federal and provincial legislation. And if you've been assigned something to do that could harm your coworker, you have an obligation to say, no, I can't do that. So how does the committee fit into all this? Well, the committee is sort of an auditor or a consultant of the IRS. Think about it like a magnifying glass held up to the stool. They are continually walking around the stool and looking for cracks and breaks, right? And a good three-legged stool would notice those things itself. It would see if one leg was becoming loose and it would fix it, right? But the committee is that extra check and balance. They're that extra set of eyes to make sure if the stool misses it, they can say, hey, whoa, 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 this one leg's getting loose. You need to tighten it up or fix it. And they do that by having, regular meetings, by doing inspections, by looking at health and safety related reports, such as incident reports, and talking about those. And then they can make sort of formal recommendations to fix things or change things. Right? That's sort of the auditor side of it. The consultant side of it is they can provide input that they think will improve health and safety. Input that they think will create or improve existing health and safety programs or procedures. And they can provide specific input on training. Well, that last training provider wasn't so good. We should use this one. This one's looking better. Or, that training really doesn't, it needs to include X and it doesn't include X, right? So they're sort of that extra help to the whole organization to make sure that everyone is working safely. But it's not their job to create health and safety. That's the employer's job, right? And then the managers and supervisors to some extent, right? They're just there as that extra support. If they have ideas to improve existing or to create new things, they can suggest those things, but it's not their job to do it, to create them. That's roles and responsibilities. Let's move into the West now with hazard management. This is the most important concept in health and safety. So we'll talk about what are hazards. There's a couple different ways of thinking about it, and this concept of hazard race. So in health and safety, it's easy to neglect the health part of it. Even I call myself sometimes a safety professional and sort of leave health off the table, right? But there are what we call health hazards, and there are what we call safety hazards. And sort of the difference between the two is that health hazards generally result in some kind of illness. We often refer to a health hazard as you've had an exposure, been exposed to X, right? And most of the time, generally, there are exceptions, but most of the time they sort of slowly set in the longer you expose yourself, right? Whereas safety hazards result in injury, and they often happen right away. So when you're doing something like an inspection, 99% of inspections are looking for safety hazards and safety hazards alone, right? Because safety hazards are the really apparent things, the things you can easily see. If I said, close your eyes and imagine a hazard, I guarantee you're imagining a safety hazard, right? They're the things like the chainsaw blade or the extension cord across the hallway or whatever, right? Getting struck by the loader on the job site. Those are the safety hazards, right? But health hazards is a much broader, much bigger way of looking at it, right? And when I look at Anishinaabemowin, there is no word for safety. Talked to several language keepers and elders and asked, what was our word for safety? What did we use traditionally? And there's no word for it, right? And I imagine that's because that was just inherent in how we did things as Anishinaabe. I think we just set the traps in a safe way. We just went hunting safely. That was just a part of it. It was just integrated into it, right? And when you look at health, Anishinaabe for health, we use Minobemadzewin, which is not really health. It's like the art of living well, right? It's such a broader, more holistic picture, right? It's about mental health. It's about spiritual health, right? It's such a bigger concept. And the Western world can learn a lot from Anishinaabe when it comes to thinking about what health hazards include, because we think about things that can affect our mental health. We need to think about things that can affect our lungs, things that could affect, our muscles and cause strains and things like that, right? That's all part of health hazards. Regardless of health or safety, the way to manage hazards is this acronym called RACE, hazard race. Recognize, assess, control, evaluate. And if you just did RACE and you did RACE really, really well, oh man, you'd be on your way to having great health and safety in place at your organization. So I'll just take you through it high level. Recognize means identify, essentially, right? We need to identify what are all the ways our workers could get hurt. And again, this is what the next webinar is going to sort of focus on, how you go about creating that identification, right? Well, actually, the whole of RACE is sort of that other webinar, right? So you need to identify all the ways that people could get hurt, looking at all the different tasks, looking at all the different material they work with, looking at the different equipment and tools and devices they handle, right? How could they get hurt by those things? And then once you identify, which this is the most important step, right? If you do a good job recognizing your hazards, you are half done. I had a mentor that used to say, when you start something, you're half done, right? And it really holds true with this model, right? Because if you do a really good job identifying hazards, you're really on your way to managing health and safety, because doesn't tend to be the hazards that we know about that tend to cause incidents and injury. It tends to be the ones that we didn't know we even had in the first place, right? Because people generally take more care, or they're more careful when they know it exists, even if you have nothing in place, right? But so that's what makes it a kind of a fundamental first step. So once you identify your hazards, now you need to understand them, which is really what assess means. You need to understand these hazards. And there's a few different ways you can understand a hazard. The first is asking why, right? Why does this hazard exist? Why is this hazard a problem? Those sorts of questions. And then another way to understand it is to compare it. Well, what are other people doing? How are other people managing this hazard, right? Are there best practices? If I type this hazard topic into the WSPS website, will I see a number of articles and videos on it? Probably, right? What do we suggest? What do safety people suggest you do to manage? There, I did it again. What do health and safety people suggest you do to deal with that particular hazard, right? And then the third way is to look at the risk. So hazard and risk are two different concepts in the health and safety world. Hazard is the thing that can cause the harm, right? And risk is a way of sort of quantifying that thing, sort of determining a level of priority. How bad of a hazard is it? If you have this hazard apple and this hazard orange, which is more serious? Which one do I spend money on? Which one do I spend time trying to figure out? You can't compare an apple to an orange, right? You can if you know the risk, right? Which one's higher risk, right? And there's sort of different ways to calculate risk. And at the next webinar, it's kind of go into some more detail on that. So all three of those will help you understand it. You don't have to do all three, you could just do one. But the more you do, the better you understand it. And you're really arming yourself with knowledge so that when it comes to control, which is a fancy way of saying protection measures, right? You have better ideas and you'll have a better understanding, to use that word again, of what you can do to protect your workers. Right? And this, many, many years ago, this used to be sort of the construct of health and safety. Recognize this as control, stop. But the problem with stopping at control is, how do you know if what you did to protect workers is actually working? That's sort of why you need to evaluate. Evaluate is not, it's sort of a weird thing, because you recognize a hazard, assess a hazard, control a hazard, but you don't evaluate a hazard. You evaluate the controls, right? Which just means you check back at them, the things you put in place to protect workers, and you make sure they're actually working. You make sure they actually made them safer. You make sure they didn't create other problems that you weren't thinking about, which can happen. Very easily that can happen, right? Sometimes you're so laser focused on fixing this, and you put a great idea in place, and it creates a different hazard that you weren't even considering, and that other hazard is way higher risk. And it's like, well, now we need to take this control away. I'd rather live with the other hazard that was lower risk than this one that we've created by putting that control, right? But you wouldn't know that if you didn't look back at the control periodically to make sure it was working, right? And, just like our medicine wheel, this is a circular concept. You continue around and around this indefinitely as long as that hazard still exists in your organization. You only leave it if you eliminate or get rid of that hazard completely, which can't be done for many hazards, but it is an option sometimes as well, right? The Western world starts with all their wheels at the top. I'm trying to push, hey, we should start in the East. That's the way we do it as Anishinaabe, right? Anyways, so figuring out a way to manage your hazards. And managing your hazards just means lowering the risk of your hazards. It doesn't mean you're gonna, make it so that there's never ever gonna be an incident again, right? So every time you have an incident, you sort of need a methodology to learn from it, which is what incident investigation is all about. So I'm going to talk about reporting, and I'm going to talk about a very basic way to investigate incidents called 5 Whys. So reporting, you need some kind of a templated method to capture incidents and a way to sort of start the investigation process. So we have a simple form on our website, free download. You can go onto wsps.ca, type in incident investigation report form, and there's a 2-page document that sort of comes up. This document, you can modify it to suit your needs. But what's sort of kind of key about this is you have a way to look at the risk level of the incident. You have a way to describe the sort of story arc of the incident, right? And you have a way to determine why that incident happened, all right on the report form, you know. And many sort of amateur incident report forms neglect the risk and neglect a way to figure out why it happened. They have a good way to capture the story, which is important. It's important to know the sequence of events and the story arc, but it's also important to know all the causes, all the reasons why those different things happened, right? Because that's where you're going to get to good solutions and good ways to prevent that incident from recurring, or at least reduce the risk, right? So page 2 is a way to sort of get into what are you going to do about it, which is the whole point of incident reporting, right? I'm not one of these, you know, some health and safety professionals are like, all accidents are preventable, and they use that sort of mantra. I'm not that person, okay? I do think it's possible, like you're just lowering risk when you're putting extra controls in place for a hazard. It doesn't mean that you're eliminating the hazard completely. The hazard's still going to exist. There's still a small chance that someone could be hurt by whatever that hazard is, right? But every incident is an opportunity to learn. Every incident is a picture into your IRS. Is it functioning properly? Is that three-legged stool staying up? Or your hazard management, you know, maybe this was an unrecognized hazard. Maybe this control wasn't evaluated well enough. Maybe you didn't understand that hazard fully when you put in the control, right? Incident reports give you high level those sorts of questions and answers to think about. They are not about finding fault. They are not about discipline, assigning blame to a particular party. There are ways to improve, and that's the way they need to be pictured, and that's the way they need to be carried forward. Because if you start blaming and disciplining and coaching people when they have incidents, you're going to drive reporting underground, right? Because no one's going to want to tell you when they messed something up or whatever. But you're also going to make it very difficult for you to be able to investigate them, because no one's going to be forthcoming with any information. They don't want to get anybody else in trouble, right? Or they don't want to get themselves in trouble, right? So you sort of need to reframe incidents as, look, we want to improve. We don't want this to happen to anybody else. You know, help us do that. Give us information so that we can make sure that no one else in your department has this same thing happen to them, right? Everything you give us is going to help us lower that risk down. So 5 whys is a simple way to investigate, right? And what you do with 5 whys is once you have that story arc, the sequence of events, you sort of look at all the different events and you say, well, why did this happen? Or why is this a problem? Right? So true story, where I came from, where I worked before, I had one incident of a worker slipping on a piece of bologna, and I thought, you know, only on the res, right? I don't think any other organizations have worker slips on bologna incident reports, right? But I'll show you, let's illustrate that. We'll do it together. If you want to use the chat and participate here, ask yourself why. So for the purpose of this exercise, make whatever assumptions you want. What's a potential reason the worker slipped on the bologna? Go ahead, throw any thoughts in the chat. Let's make this a bit interactive for our last few minutes together here. And again, no right or wrong answers here. Whatever you think. Okay, it fell out of the bread. Sure, yeah, it fell out of the. Maybe we had bologna on a bun or bologna on scone, right? No one picked it up. Sure. So let's do each of these. Let me do the first one. Fell out of the scone. Scone. Spell it. Maybe I'll put bannock. So it fell out of the bannock. So then we just ask why again, right? So what's a potential reason the scone fell out of the bannock? Again, make whatever assumptions you want. Any thoughts? Throw it in the chat here. Okay, so maybe the person tripped holding it, and then the bologna fell out, and then they tripped again on the bologna. This is a real doozy of an incident here, isn't it? Right? Okay, so maybe they tripped on something earlier. So then we ask, well, why? Why did they trip on something earlier? Well, maybe it was, not cleaned up. Right? So let's make it not something. Let's make it a cord or something. Tripped on a cord. Cord not cleaned up. So then we say, why? And it's like, oh, we don't have we didn't create a rule. We didn't create an expectation to clean up your cords when you're finished with them. No rule to, I don't know, put away. You know who's amazing at 5 whys? 2-year-olds, toddlers. You got to sort of channel a toddler when you're sort of doing an incident investigation. You just ask why multiple times, right? We call it 5 whys. It might be 2 whys. It might be 10 whys. You just ask why until you get to a point where it feels like a logical stopping point, or the answer to that why is not going to help you, right? You know, when you're like, just because to your toddler, you can feel that as a parent. For any parents in here, perhaps you have that or know what I'm talking about, right? That's when you know you can stop, right? No rule to put away. There's, even if we ask why to that, it's not going to give us anything, right? We know sort of that logical stopping point. But 5 whys is not a linear process, right? So there might be other reasons why the worker slipped on the bologna, right? No one cleaned it up. Right? Then we might ask why. Well, there's the not my job mentality, perhaps, right? So then it's like, okay, let's make sure we communicate to everybody. You know what? If you see something, you should say something or do something, right? And that's the beauty of 5 whys too, is that those preventive measures, those corrective actions are right there for the picking at the bottoms of all your sort of why analyses, right? No rule to put away, create a rule to put away the cords when you're finished with them, right? No one cleaned it up. Well, make sure everybody understands, if you see a spill, it's your job to wipe that spill up, right? It's not your job to call the custodian. Or if you see bologna on the floor in the lunchroom, it's your job to throw that in the garbage, right? I think none of us are, even the chief wouldn't be above doing that, right? You're preventing somebody else slipping on that by doing that, right? And that's sort of the basics of how you do an investigation, right? Anyway, is there any questions about those sort of 4 areas I talked about? So commitment, setting roles and responsibilities, managing your hazards, and investigating incidents, which are sort of the 4 main pillars of any good, strong health and safety. 30 seconds, throw something in the chat. Nothing, I was monitoring it as we went along. Nobody really was asking anything as we went along. But yeah, I'll make sure Madison has my email and blast that out to all of you. If you want to ask me something privately, I'm totally cool with that as well. All right. So we can help with all this stuff. Our website has tons and tons of free resources, like 2,000 articles, tools, templates, videos, all kinds of free things in there. It's all searchable. You just type in the search box what you're interested in. Incident investigation report, health and safety policy, heat stress, poison ivy, whatever it is that is causing a concern for you, whether it's a hazard or any kind of health and safety related topic, have a look there. And I'm sure you'll find some good stuff to help you through it. We do all sorts of consulting, lots of prepaid, we call it consulting, because some of the WSIB premiums you pay partially fund our organization. So there's lots of things we can do for free to help you with health and safety. We do all sorts of training. That's a big part of my role as a trainer at WSPS. And there's something called the Health and Safety Excellence Program, which I strongly suggest you look into. I know Nokiwen, actually, aren't you a provider of that as well? Yeah, so that is doing the things that you should be doing anyway and getting Junya back from WSIB for doing it. So it's a great sort of incentive to do health and safety and give you a little bit of money back into your budget, back into your pocket for health and safety. So there are a few upcoming webinars. My colleague, April 17th, is going to be doing the hazard prevention program, which is really that hazard race I talked about, but more sort of fleshed out how you actually do that. I kind of talked about it from a theoretical construct. She's going to talk about how you actually apply that concept. Lateral violence in June, so talking about what that is and how you can sort of put things in place. And well, really, that's back to Anna Dandewind, right? Respect. And then I'm going to be back in October to talk about conflict and how we can manage conflict in the workplace. Okay. So let's recap what we covered today. In terms of our medicine wheel, we talked about making sure you have good, strong commitment, right? You have set roles and responsibilities, you manage your hazards, and you investigate all of your incidents. And that sort of lines up with those grandfathers of love, Sagiwewin, respect, Menadendumuin, wisdom, Nabuakawin, and honesty, Wekwadziwin, right? So if you just do those 4 things and think about those 4 things, you will be on your way from a health and safety perspective.